Hello, everybody. Welcome to the VulnWise show, where we bring you exclusive interviews with cybersecurity experts and thought leaders to help you conquer the chaos of vulnerability and exposure management. I'm Steve Carter, the CEO and co-founder at Nucleus Security, and I'm joined by my partner in chaos and friend Scott Kuffer, who is the COO and also co-founder at Nucleus Security. And today we have none other than Dr. Nikki Robinson on the show. For many of you, she needs no introduction. But for those of you that don't know her, Nikki has over a decade of cybersecurity experience. She's been working at IBM now for over 4 years, I think in a variety of roles there. But today her title is Senior Technical Staff Member and Senior Manager at IBM. Hopefully I got that right.
Yep.
And there she's leading strategy and managing deployments for email security initiatives, threat platform, application development, and identity access management. In her free time, Nikki is an adjunct professor at University of Maryland, and she's written books about vulnerability management. She's done podcasts. She has won all kinds of awards, and she volunteers and gives a lot back to the community. If I tried to capture everything Nikki has done, we would be here for the whole show and not have any time to talk about anything else. So I'll stop there. Nikki, it's an honor to have you on the show. Did I miss anything?
No, all good. Thank you, Steve, for that wonderful intro. Thank you.
Sure thing, sure thing.
I'm
My pleasure.
exhausted just hearing about it.
It's a lot.
I don't know how you do it. Okay. Nikki, normally we keep this show focused on vulnerability and exposure management topics that everyone can learn from. And we really don't discuss news too much and kind of like what's going on day to day, week to week. This week, by the way, week of April 14th is kind of special in that this is the week that for maybe about 24 hours, just about everyone in our industry, our community thought that the MITRE CV program was shutting down due to a lack of funding. And CISA jumped in and saved the day right at the last moment. And I think they've provided like a year's worth of funding. And so crisis averted for now. But I think that everyone agrees if the CV program were to just disappear like everyone thought it was going to, it would change the vulnerability ecosystem, for lack of a better term. And without a global agreed upon identifier for vulnerabilities that every vendor in the ecosystem will start to assign their own identifiers, suddenly it becomes really hard and really challenging to analyze vulnerabilities, to research vulnerabilities, to prioritize vulnerabilities. So, Nikki, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, your general thoughts on this whole mess. I'm interested in how companies should be thinking about this and preparing for maybe a potential failure like this, how the vendors in our space should be thinking about compensating and like what it would be like in a world where a global ID for vulnerabilities doesn't exist. So I'll just pause there. Any thoughts you have on what's going on?
I love that we started with a super light, easy question to answer. No, this one, it is very pertinent, right? This is especially for all of us who do and love vulnerability management. You know, it was a very interesting week, right? Because we were sort of like, okay, if funding does lapse and there's going to be gaps in processing and who's going to own anything going forward, all of those types of questions come up. I think from a practitioner standpoint, you know, and a consumer of vulnerability data, one of the biggest things I start to think of is, okay, if we are going to have different vendors who are submitting different, you know, their own vulnerability IDs, and are they going to use the same CVSS scoring system? Are they going to use their own scoring system? How does risk management take place when you have multiple different sort of entries for that? I take it with the same way that I see CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, in the way that if we don't have that as a basis for what we do for vulnerability management, you can build enrichments and additional information on top of it, right? Like EPSS, is it an external facing asset, add context? But without a base platform to start from, vulnerability scoring becomes really challenging. And I think the same from a vulnerability identification standpoint, because then where do people go when they want to submit? Do you have to go to all these different websites? Where, you know, kind of where do you go? So I think the National Vulnerability Database, the NVD, where we have all of our CVE IDs, I think that has to be part of the discussion too, right? Does NVD who does it get owned by? Does it get moved to somebody else? So I think what we're just sort of starting to uncover is that there's a lot of inherent complexity here for a lot of different systems that are tied to CVE IDs. So I think still TBD, there's probably still some discovery to do. But I think people should be considering it, especially as, you know, at some point, you know, maybe it'll go away. Maybe it'll continue to be owned by MITRE, who knows? But I think it's important for people to start preparing now. It's the same way we build resiliency into systems. We should have resiliency in our vulnerability management capabilities. So where do you consume vulnerability data from? Is it just from the NVD? Maybe consider some other sources. Yeah, that would be my best advice.
Yeah, no, that's all really good points. I can tell you, at least in Nucleus, right? Because we are not doing vulnerability discovery, we're kind of like one layer abstracted, and we rely on the tools that we ingest data from. And so that's kind of the first line where they would have to scramble and figure out, hey, what are we going to do? How are we going to, what kind of identifiers are we going to put on these vulnerabilities, and how are we going to score them and everything else? And then we would ingest that data. But one thing that we instantly started working on is, okay, if there is no global identifier, that limits our ability to group vulnerabilities together, because a big part of what we do is that correlation and deduplication and grouping of vulnerabilities, and all of a sudden that becomes really hard. But then at the same time, we're thinking, okay, well, maybe the impact is even lower, because a lot of the way that at least our users kind of use the platform is they'll say, hey, just group all of these vulnerabilities by the fix or by the patch. And so it really doesn't matter like what their IDs are or whatever. It's just like if you can just group them all together by the common thing that it takes to fix them all, that's good enough. And so, yeah, we're kind of thinking about things, different types of things that would impact us. But no, all great points. Scott, you have any general thoughts on this topic before we move on?
You know that I do, Steve.
I
You
know
know that
you
I
do.
do.
That was a
But
silly question.
I mean, we only talked about it at lunch for the last 3 days straight. So, yeah, this is a very well thought out answer, obviously. But what's really fascinating is it feels like a bit of a rewind, right? So, ever since I've been in the industry, we've had this concept of a CVE identifier, right? And there were a lot of challenges with it, but in a way, it's kind of like saying, before the world invented the concept of zero, like what would you do now to communicate about nothing, right? In the context of like I have something and nothing. And so it's in a weird way, it's like the people always like kind of jump to throwing CVSS under the bus, right? Whenever like people talked about the NVD, because for those of you not paying attention at home over the last year, there's been a lot of distress and anger at sort of the NVD system as a whole. So in a weird way, this is kind of a cathartic, like symbolic moment, I think, for just how the industry is feeling. And it's cool that we've kind of come together in a way, but at the same time, it's the same people throwing NVD under the bus that are the ones that say, please, please save it. So it's really fascinating to see the dynamics of the industry, but like even risk scoring, right? Everybody talks about RBVM and everybody thinks about how exciting and, oh man, we're prioritizing amazingly. But what's happening is that most risk scoring systems are built on a base score that gets set by CVSS and then just adjusting it. So then the question becomes, well, where does this base rating and foundation come from? And so it's a really interesting dynamic to think of a world where that doesn't exist anymore. And I don't necessarily mean that in a positive or negative way, but it doesn't seem like it would be a positive thing in my view, especially since we struggle so much with identification of vulnerabilities today. Having a unique identifier for how we talk about risks and weaknesses seems like a pretty important part of the industry, and to the point where even being owned by a single entity like the U.S. government could be risky, right? Because then, as we've seen, we're at the whims of potential administration and political decisions, which something like this being relied on around the world, it's kind of tough to imagine that.
So you want to put it on the blockchain then?
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Web3, baby.
That was a joke. That was a joke.
Boy.
Okay.
That's right. Put it all
Uh,
on black, Steve. That's what I want to do.
all right. All right, guys. Well, all right. Well, I wanna kind of move on here because there's a lot we want to talk to Nikki about today. And starting super high level, the topic of human factors is something Nikki and I have talked about before. It's a topic I love talking about. I know it's a topic that Nikki is super passionate about because I think you did most of your or a lot of your PhD work on that. I think you wrote a book that touched on that. I feel like we'd be missing an opportunity if we didn't talk about human factors for a bit. So for those that aren't aware, I'll give you my version. Human factors is at least in the context of cybersecurity, right? It refers to how human behavior and psychology can influence security outcomes. And personally, this is a topic that I've become more and more interested in over time myself. And I see every day in the business how much human factors determines the success of our customers, not just our business, but our customers' vulnerability and exposure management programs, right? It's a direct impact. But still one of those areas that you don't hear a lot of people talking about. or at least I don't, in the bubbles that I exist in. There aren't a lot of people writing about it, in my opinion, anyway. So to start with, I'm just top level. What was it, Nikki, that really inspired your interest in this area of human factors within cybersecurity?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One was I actually was a psychology undergrad before I went into computer science. So I started in psychology. I wanted to go into probably like neuropsychology. I was really interested in abnormal psychology specifically. So I very lofty, ambitious goals. I wanted to come up with a cure for schizophrenia, which now at the time thinking like as an 18-year-old, maybe that was a little ambitious. But yeah, so I did 2 years of a psych undergrad, and that was when I got really interested in IT and software engineering. So I kind of switched over. And really what was sort of the trigger for me, or the understanding that the technical bits weren't going to be enough. I was probably 10 years into my IT career and doing the DSC in cybersecurity. And I was really focused on the technical outcomes of the vulnerability scores and how people scored them. I didn't really care how people felt at the time, at least as part of the experiment. And then I conducted the experiment and I thought, well, but why did people feel this way? They just scored these vulnerabilities like in a crazy way I never would have expected. I wish I would have talked to them and understood why they did that. That was really what led me to the PhD in human factors. And then just as a practitioner, I started seeing that technical analysis just really wasn't giving me everything that I needed. It wasn't really telling me the story of maybe why a vulnerability wasn't remediated, of why somebody was stuck on something, why two teams can't get along. A lot of it I found was there would be teams that would be kind of on opposing sides that were trying to fix the same thing, but in different ways. And so they just would disagree with each other and then nothing would get done. And so I found that really understanding why people are working the way that they work or how they understand a problem, those types of things really got me interested in understanding the human factor, especially in cybersecurity, because I think it can really positively impact risk management activities if you understand the people that are doing the work behind it.
Yeah. Yeah. So anytime I get the opportunity to give advice to young folks in college, I always say combine domain expertise and you could do really awesome stuff, right? It's one thing, like computer science is great and psychology is great, but the combination of the two enables you to do things that not many people can do. And so it's awesome. You saw a gap and felt like you could be part of the solution. And yeah, and because you're able to combine those two professions, right? That's to me, that's where like a lot of the magic happens. So awesome. So the next thing I want to ask you about, just kind of double clicking on the human factor stuff a little bit. When it comes to AI, right? And I hate to be the guy that like drops AI into
I feel like you're
every
the guy
subject.
that's every one of these episodes, it's you that leads with AI,
I
Steve.
know it kind of is. I'm sorry, but I have to bring it up. I think this is a valid question though, right? Because I'm starting to read more and more about these companies that are expected to be, and are valued at, not expected to be. Some of them are already valued at, $1 billion or more, right? Like unicorn companies, and they've got a really small number of employees, like less than 10, sometimes less than 5 employees. And I think I keep hearing that it's not long before we see the first one-person company valued at $1 billion, which blows my mind. I'm super envious of that. Obviously, being in business myself, because I know how hard it is to grow a business, and so that it's just it's crazy. And so I guess when you think about this, and then you think about human factors, right? And the fact that a lot of cybersecurity tasks and cybersecurity roles are starting to be automated by AI. To what degree does that make human factors either less or more relevant and important today?
I think it makes it even more relevant personally. And I love this question so much because, by the way, I'm usually the person that also brings up AI. So you don't have to feel like you're on a lonely
I
island.
don't have to apologize.
Yeah, I think it's part of our conversation, you know? It's just sort of become part of what we have to kind of discuss as tool sets and, you're right, skill sets. I do think the human component is even more crucial now though. To me, it's a pendulum, right? The pendulum is always going to swing. To me, it's swinging towards AI right now. I do think having a fully AI baked solution for anything, right? Like take incident response. Could you imagine an agentic AI solution that from start of an incident to the end of an incident handles everything? I don't know if I've ever worked on an incident where I would fully hand over the reins to an agent.
hard to imagine. But I guarantee
Yeah.
you there's a business out there that's probably marketing the fact that they can do that somewhere. I mean, I'm guessing it probably
Whatever's
already exists.
after whatever's after Gen Alpha will be on board with it, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
they're gonna be like, oh wait, we're just gonna let algorithms do everything for us.
But to your
Yeah.
point, I
So
can't imagine it. Yeah.
yeah. So I think there's my point being, I think the human element of this is even more important. It's not that we can't augment and really help us to kind of get things done. To me, the picture of data is so big right now. The amount of data that a human has to look at, especially at a large company, it's insane. There's no way that a person could actively look at all of that data and act appropriately, I think, without some sort of help of AI. And I think about upskilling, things like that, it's got a really great, wonderful use case for. But I think there's going to still be plenty of cyber and IT tasks that you still probably want to have a human involved in, and understand what's going on, because there, at least right now, I can't see a fully agentic solution that could solve all of our problems, maybe a couple of things. But to me, that also gives time for our people, our analysts, our engineers to upskill. I do think we have to learn how to work with AI, right? Like, we gotta be AI smart and use it in the right ways, but I don't, to me, it doesn't fully remove the human from the loop, because then you could miss things, right? And then if you miss things, who's responsible? Is your executive gonna say, "Well, the bot missed it?"
Who's
I
managing
don't
that bot?
know. I don't know. Yeah,
Who's
I
that
mean,
bot
I
report
mean,
to?
yeah.
that's right. We're gonna need to do a retro. We're gonna need to do a write up.
Well, I think it's yeah, I think it's got interesting, legal implications too, right? Because we have a lot of regulations and law around how often do you respond, how quickly do you respond, how quickly do you tell people that you responded, all of those things. So I do think, especially the incident response use case is quite interesting, when we're talking about a human being part of the loop.
Yeah, yeah. Soon we'll have performance improvement plans for PIPs for
I mean, yeah,
AI
For the bot.
agents.
it's yeah, you're gonna have to prompt it differently. That's the performance improvement plan. But what's interesting to your point, Nikki, I think around making humans more important, what I kind of anticipate happening here is that, you know, especially as AI goes from what it is into the future, there has to be incremental, I mean, very fast incremental progress and change, but it still is on a spectrum. And so what it feels like is we're going to start having AI deal with the easier stuff, right? Like, hey, like first level alerts, as an example, right? In the incident response process. But then the stuff that all of our analysts are going to have to deal with are actually the harder, bigger, hairier problems that where it's not an obvious solution, right? And then AI will hopefully get better at being able to handle some of that stuff. But I think that's where, like, naturally it's going to push humans into basically every decision they make instead of it being a low level decision of, hey, is this an alert? Does it matter or not? Up to like, hey, every decision is potentially a real challenge because you've really distilled down the noise. And so for me, I feel like that's where a lot of this every human becomes more impactful potentially rather than
Yes.
less impactful.
And I think growing skills too, right? Like, I personally, I was on help desk when I started my IT career. I don't know that help desk is really a thing anymore. It's not. You can automate a lot of those processes. You might still have a tier 2 or a tier 3 implementation of IT operations, but tier 1 can be handled for the most part through automation or some sort of AI solution. So, I think it's just similar in a lot of fields, right? Like, a lot of the sort of easy, kind of easier, I don't want to say easier tasks, but some of the tasks that are a lot of like manual repetition, we can kind of replace that with AI and help grow skill sets for people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as I think about just at a really high level, I mean, on one hand, like a really simple and probably dumb argument is like, hey, in the future, companies are going to be tech companies anyway. Let's just focus on tech companies. Will be much smaller. They'll have way less people. Maybe a company that required 200 people only has 10, and therefore, you know, the human factors type things, culture, stuff like that, less important. But the other flip side to that is, hey, if you only have 10 people, just one or two of those people leaving would make a massive impact, negative impact to the business. And so those people are way more critical. And therefore, you could argue it's even more important to manage those things, right? Like generally, as especially startup land, a 10-person startup isn't not really talking about culture too much. Like things are just kind of happening organically. And there might be a world where it's like, oh no, you have to focus on these types of things much more at a much smaller, earlier stage than you normally would because, any person leaving is a huge impact, right? So it's interesting.
Yeah. And oh man. Yeah. I mean, there's so much to do in a startup. We could go on about startups all day, but I just think that, there's no abatement of the challenge, right? If everything that you're dealing with is just an escalation, it becomes a really challenging environment in in a high growth startup, already a super challenging environment. But if there's like no breaks or relaxation, everything that's getting delivered to you is just, I mean, you think we have alert fatigue now. Imagine if it's just super critical existential alert fatigue all the time. And then it's like the burnout. Anyway, burnout could be a real big problem in that case. But I feel like we're very easy to get sidetracked. Sorry, Nikki. But we are also obviously here to talk about vulnerability prioritization and management as well.
Yay.
Obviously, you've written a lot of content about this. You have a book that we love that we've read. Both of us have read, by the way. And
Yeah.
so
Thank
we
you.
appreciate it. And so, one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about, we actually have said, hey, we need to talk to Nikki at some point, just so we could talk about the book and some of the findings in the book. But one of the questions is, especially in the context of the larger conversation we're having, what have you seen as far as metrics at the board level, right? When we talk about vulnerability management, 5 years ago, not a single Fortune 500 board probably really knew what a vulnerability was, but it feels like it's becoming a lot more important and high visibility. So, what do you see as security leadership and CISOs? How are they communicating vulnerabilities to the board, and how do they do that successfully?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share hopefully some tactics or some techniques, some data that might be most interesting, I think, to look at. And really from a vulnerability management picture, I think in general. Vulnerability management has changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years, and it's going to continue to evolve, I think, pretty rapidly, partially because technology continues to change so quickly, right? We're just constantly trying to kind of keep up with the next wave of technology, not to include AI, agentic AI, Gen AI, like add all of those bits in there too. So I think that the picture around vulnerability management has really shifted from fix everything to fix the most important things. How do we close the door? That's the biggest thing. What's external facing? That is always the most interesting thing to me. What is external facing? And then what network devices do I need to be worried about? That is the other thing that I'm constantly interested in. I want to know what network devices we have. I want to know what version they're on, because I think when it comes to exploitable vulnerabilities, we see a lot of the same types of trends, right? Around network devices, around specific types of applications, and really the same type of vulnerability chaining techniques that were even used 3 years ago. We're still seeing at just a more sophisticated level. Credential theft, all of that. They're just trying to get in any way that they can. So my biggest thing about metrics and reporting is around identity and access management, because that can be the biggest gap, and we don't always have a CVE ID. To your point earlier, Steve, we don't always have a CVE ID associated with account management or overly permissioned accounts. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. So metrics around identity and access management, metrics around highly exploited vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that are exploited in the wild, right? Hopefully you have none of that in your environment. But if you do, how do you get it out of there quick? And then other metric I think that people are really interested in is more around what's actually in our environment. What do I care about, right? What should I really care about? Because let's say you have 10,000 assets. I'm not really worried about 10,000 of them, right? There's probably 1,000 or maybe even 500 that are the most important assets that I'm interested in. To me, it's about shrinking the picture from I'm worried about everything to these are the things I care about. And some of that is threat intelligence based too. So, what do I care about based on my sector, based on the type of data that we have? If I'm in healthcare, I probably really care about my ransomware footprint. Like, what am I looking at? If I get hit with ransomware, what's going down? So, I think those are probably the biggest areas that I want to talk about or I want to share information around, because those are the biggest places. If something happens, it could be, could potentially be bad.
So it's interesting, right? To Scott's point, like this, it seems like more and more, him and I are definitely seeing this. More and more organizations are bubbling up these types of metrics that you're talking about up to the board level. And when it comes to like the what next, I mean, the question is always, how do we make this better? Because a lot of times, especially when you start first reporting on things, the picture is not pretty, and a lot of folks can be reluctant to even do it at all for that reason, because people are scared for their jobs in some cases. It's like it could not be a good look. And when it comes to improving these types of metrics over time. My mind always goes to automation, and I know that in your most recent book, I believe, Effective Vulnerability Management, you guys had a chapter on, I believe you called it continuous vulnerability management, and you talked a lot about automation. And I think they go hand in hand, right? You can't really have continuous, I think, without a high degree of automation.
For sure.
But and you kind of laid out in the book, right? Vulnerability management's a lot more than just scanning and patches, right? There's a lot of analytics that need to go into generating these types of metrics and bubbling that stuff up and really measuring the program and monitoring it the way you need to monitor it. So I guess from what you've seen, at least in practice, how much better are organizations getting at automating this stuff? Are you starting to see like really highly automated programs and organizations really adopt that mindset of, hey, this is just a continuous process. It's a machine that keeps running versus like the point in time, hey, we've got this in our calendar. We have to do this thing and perform some triage. Are you starting to see more of an automated approach out in practice?
So,
Sensing the skepticism. All right.
So I think, yeah, I have a terrible poker face, by the way. There's a reason I don't play poker. No, I think so. This is just even me going out and speaking at conferences and speaking with people. Just from talking with people, I hear a full gambit. Right. To me, it still seems like we've got quite the spread of maturity levels at different organizations. Sometimes it's due to funding, sometimes it's due to different priorities. I would say there are some really super mature organizations because sometimes I talk to people and they're like, ugh, I'm already doing everything from your talk. And I'm like, oh, good. Then, ignore me. Sounds like you're doing everything. Just ignore what I said. To smaller organizations, like I've spoken with people from non-for-profits who really struggle with automation because they don't have the time for it, they don't have the funding for it. It just hasn't been, super critical because they're constantly just fighting fires, right? They're a small team. They're trying to do IT operations and vulnerability management and everything all together. So I really see I still see a wide range of maturity levels in programs. I think the teams that are able to succeed and do really well, and I can speak to one use case from years ago. There was one of the places I was working with, they had relatively, I would say like they were sort of middle of the road, like kind of vulnerability management program. It can take anywhere from 6 months to a year, and you have to be really fully dedicated to, making it a priority. It can take that long, but I do think automation can be you can leverage it in so many ways. Some of that comes down to, and this is where the human factor comes back in, some of it's understanding where your challenge is. Because I think sometimes people say the challenge is we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough time. I always challenge that because sometimes it's the priorities need to be adjusted, right? If I go back to leadership and I say, my priority is fixing this reporting mechanism because it doesn't work for my system owners. They can't figure out which vulnerabilities to fix. They don't understand prioritization. That's where the problem is. So I think sometimes it comes down to crafting a really great problem statement. Then you can kind of say, actually, this is what we need to do to get there versus, I think sometimes people are like, well, we need a new tool. This tool isn't working for us. And it's like, well, maybe it's the tool, maybe it's the configuration. Why don't we try a different configuration, right? Or see if we can adjust things or automate. So yeah, so a really long way of saying I'm seeing a lot of different vulnerability management programs. Yeah.
All over the map. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's I think that's what we're seeing on our side too, Scott. Like, I mean, I will say some of the most mature, and this is, in the last year or two, I've been seeing this, but some of the most mature vulnerability management programs in some ways have been with some really small organizations. And I've been surprised about that. But to your point, I think generally speaking, the smaller the org, the more it is kind of like a chicken and the egg. It's like, well, I can't afford to do it, but you're small and you have not a lot of resources. You really can't afford not to do it either,
Yeah.
right? So you've
Yeah. It's a
got
challenge.
to your point, prioritize, which is like everything. Scott and I talk about prioritization, not just in the context of vulnerabilities, pretty much all day, every day. Everything is about prioritization. If you say you don't have time, all you're saying is, I'm not able to prioritize this above all the other things that I'm working on. And oftentimes when you dig in, that's not always the case, right? So it's interesting.
I was start laughing so hard as you were talking. I was like, this sounds exactly like our daily conversations.
Yeah.
Love you guys at Nucleus. You guys are doing great. With all that being said, so one of the things that I always think about in where do you start with automation, right? And I know a lot of folks tend to start with the prioritization because that is one where I think, they get the most information delivered to you on a silver platter from all the different tools that you have in place. And, there's things like threat intelligence that you can just plug a feed in and then start, adjusting and toggling switches on and off. You don't have to do all the hard work of some of this asset management and asset inventory stuff to start getting like to the down to that which five assets are the most critical for you. So, across this giant spread of maturity within these different programs, when you look at the less mature organizations and they say, "Hey, I want to get into prioritization and what should I shoot for? Where do I start?" And like, in the context of, again, our earlier conversation around NVD maybe going away at some point in the future, how do you think about vulnerability prioritization at a high level? Because there's tons of thoughts around this, but we'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer a different question, and then I'm gonna come back to that question, and I
Perfect.
promise it'll make sense. Okay.
Feels just like it. Like I said, I feel like I'm talking just a normal day-to-day conversation. This is
Yeah, yeah,
perfect.
yeah. So I actually like to start with automating remediation because I find that a lot of places are so bogged down with the vulnerabilities, the patches, everything that they're dealing with that they can't even think about prioritizing vulnerabilities because they're like, yeah, but I have 10,000 vulnerabilities on 10,000 assets, or pick your sort of situation. Sometimes it's as simple as providing an automated mechanism for them to do their patching. Sometimes I find people don't have that. Some larger, more mature places do. But if they're on the smaller scale or smaller size, getting them to like just automatically patch all of their test and dev servers, like I don't care if that server goes down, right? I think getting out of that, like I don't care if test and dev go down, at least I have to have a place to test my patches. And getting them into this automation around remediation, I think gives them a little bit of that breathing room that they can then start to think about, okay, how do I prioritize? I found that works in the past because typically technical leaders, they're too overwhelmed with like, I've got a backlog of 20K or 50K vulnerabilities. I can't think about anything else. And so you get to that decision paralysis perspective of prioritization. And so once you can fix a few of those things, then you're like, okay, we got some of these in the backlog fixed. Let's go ahead and start talking about what's next and what's next. And usually that changes the conversation from how can I fix the most amount of vulnerabilities in the shortest amount of time? Once you've kind of gotten the big stuff under control, then you can go back and say, okay, I'm most interested in the top 5 exploited vulnerabilities. That's always my first place I start because you're going to have vulnerabilities that are scored as medium and low on the CVSS by CVSS. They're still exploited and highly exploited. Some of them are actively exploited. So to me, it's more about changing the picture of how people see vulnerabilities. And I usually start with highly exploited or highly exploitable, right? Like using EPSS if we think that it could be exploited. Again, I'm going to be like a broken record, but like network devices, I never want to leave those unpatched. I want to have a regular cadence where I'm patching those things, right? And that we have a good process when, well, I don't know, maybe like an RCE comes out. I kind of want to have a good process for quickly remediating those and then getting back to our regular patching cadence. So I don't know if I actually answered your question, but I think you have
I
to
think
kind of
I
get
No, I
to.
think you did.
Okay, good.
That's the best answer, honestly. Makes a lot of sense. We talk about a lot of those same types of things, and when we think about like that was what I was kind of alluding to there when I say there are a lot of different schools of thought. There's the fix as much as possible with the least amount of time, and then there's the cherry picking, finding the needles in the haystack. And Steve and I have always talked about, well, you really need to do both, right? And it's the balance of both that really unlocks the prioritization within a program. So hearing you kind of confirm that with me trying to just talk vaguely around that to see what your thoughts were, I think you answered it very well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, you were kind of hitting on all the places, and Scott asked the question, where would you start, right? And 100%, I think starting with automating patching to the degree that you can. It's funny how many people are still afraid to automate the patching of anything, right? A lot of large enterprises won't auto patch, critical servers in production. I think that still probably makes sense. But to your point about dev and test, that's completely valid. And then starting from a prioritization perspective on exploitability makes sense. Kind of going a level deeper, though, one thing that you have talked a lot about in the past is vulnerability chaining. And I know it's something that you wrote some papers on for your PhD. And that was years ago, I think, that you were really digging into that.
I started in 2017 writing about vulnerability chaining. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's been
you
almost 10 years.
I don't know if you invented the term, but like, a lot of people have talked a lot more about it since then, and now a popular kind of topic is attack path mapping, which can, in my mind, is very much related in that it can illuminate the potential for vulnerability chaining, right? Helps to shine a light on some of that. And so I don't know. On one hand, I'm kind of optimistic that the industry is maturing and we're approaching this point where things like vulnerability chaining can be accounted for and how we prioritize vulnerabilities, but it still feels like we're not quite there. I mean, that's a pretty sophisticated operation, right? Those are not easy things to do necessarily in practice. And at the same time, I think a lot of organizations still can't do or struggle with some of the easier things like, hey, just patch everything on the SysAkev list within a reasonable time frame. Like that is a non-trivial task for a lot of organizations still today. So when we get into phone chaining and attack path and everything else and how that gets incorporated in, it feels like it feels like there's still a lot of progress we need to make. But all that said, when you think about how different data points like this could be used for prioritization, how important in your mind do you think vulnerability chaining and attack path and things like that are? And when do you think we'll actually start to see those things be reflected in how organizations are actually doing this, doing prioritization in practice? Do you think this is something like we're on the cusp of it, or do you think it's still like just long way to go, like and you're skeptical like me?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I will tell you when my DSC came out in 2019, I was told at the time, even by the panel when I went to defend and when I published my research, they were like, "Okay, cool. People will care in 10 years." And I was like, "Okay, I'll
Oh,
just wait.
wow.
I'll just wait 10 years." But I do think that the people that kind of gave me that advice at the time were right because we're almost mid 2025. I have seen so many more security experts talking about vulnerability chaining, writing blogs and content, speaking about it at conferences. We're seeing more tools that are talking about exposure management and connecting networking and ports and protocols with the actual systems and vulnerabilities. So I think we're definitely getting there. I think it's more of a conversation. And I can say I've been very encouraged even in the last year. I've had so many people reach out to me, both from the academic sector that are starting to teach this type of content in undergrad programs, which I think is critical, that anybody going into the technology field understands and thinks about vulnerabilities in that context and not just as single entities. But I've also from the private sector, or excuse me, from like private sector and public sector side, I've had people say, "Oh yeah, I built this research into my security program or my security policy." So people are starting to, I think, change the way that they're talking about vulnerabilities. So I'm encouraged. I think it's probably a slow roll, but hopefully by 2029, I'll come back here and it'll be it'll be a bigger conversation.
Okay. So don't hold breath, but it's coming. I mean, I will say like there are signs. I mean, you mentioned identity, and like that's one area where we do see tools now that maybe it's not vuln chaining in terms of CVEs, but it's weaknesses in identity systems that are chained together to get to some really nasty outcomes. So we're starting to see conceptually things show up, but yeah, in terms of just
And
straight
even
up like
vendors, yeah, and even vendors now are submitting vulnerability chains instead of just a vulnerability. So we've been seeing it from like Active Directory, VMware. There's a bunch of different ones that have submitted actual vulnerability chains. So you use two in combination. And I was so encouraged to see that even vendors are starting to think about their own products that way.
yeah, we should just force that requirement. Like you have to think about it and fill out
How
this
can this
field
be
and tell us.
used?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it
there's
says
only a way.
privilege escalation equals privilege escalate, and you have to tell. Yeah, there
Yeah.
you go. I
Yes.
like it. Getting the nerd juices flowing over here, and just in time for us to run out of time too. So we did run up at our allotted time here, Nikki, and we always like to leave our guests with the final word on anything you're working on right now, where people can find you, anything else that you'd like to leave our audience with.
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. That's the best place to find me. I'm always there. The biggest things coming for me is I am going to be writing a third book, hopefully out next year.
Nice.
So keep an eye on my LinkedIn. I'll be posting about it. Yeah, that's the biggest thing for me is sort of coming back to human factors and vulnerability management. So yeah, that's the most exciting bit that's happening.
Very cool. Well, if you want to give us some, or if you're ever looking for some feedback before it's released, Scott and I are here for you.
Happy to get it.
No promises it'll be good
Awesome.
feedback, but it'll be feedback nonetheless.
Good point, Scott.
I'll take it.
All right. Well, with that, thank you very much, Dr. Nikki Robinson, for joining us on the VulnWise show. And thank you, everybody at home, for listening. And you know where to find us on YouTube, everywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.